Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner, the Environmental Law and Policy Center's Chief Executive Officer. We're going to be talking this morning about what's the status of play in legislation on Capitol Hill in Washington, what's the status of play in Springfield. Quick heads up, this is being recorded. We're going to take this webinar and put it on Facebook so that you can share it with friends and colleagues who weren't able to join us this morning. And with us this morning, with me, is my terrific colleagues Ann Mesnikoff, ELPC's Federal Legislative Director based in Washington, D.C., and David McEllis, ELPC's Illinois Legislative Director, who's coming from Springfield today. We're on the ground. We're in the hearing rooms. We're in the courtrooms. We're in the legislative hallways. ELPC at this extraordinary time is both playing defense on the federal side and offense, as you'll hear, in states like Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, as well as Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio, where we have some things to really get done, accomplished at the state level, while the federal government is unfortunately stepping back. ELPC is stepping up. We're standing up. We're rolling up our sleeves. We're working to get things done at this extraordinarily challenging times. Thank you for joining us today. And let's talk a little bit about what's going on in DC and what's going on in Illinois. And we'll have some opportunity for Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Let me turn to Ann Mesnikoff. Ann is our Federal Legislative Director. Ann's based in Washington, D.C., and tell us what's going on in Congress and how we can be effective on the Great Lakes and on the many, many issues that people care about when it comes to protecting healthier, clean air, when it comes to safe, clean drinking water for people in the Midwest and nationally.
Thanks, Howard. Well, there's a lot to cover, so I'll start with what I hope is sort of a bright note, a positive note. I think everybody's following the news knows there's a lot of chaos in DC and a lot of disruption that's happening and will continue to happen. But one program that's very important to our work at ELPC and with coalition partners across the Great Lakes is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI. This is a program that started in 2010 and is meant to provide additive support to the US EPA, the US Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife Service, and many other entities that do work across the Great Lakes to restore them and protect them and improve water quality for drinking water, fish, and recreation, and more. This program needs to be reauthorized every 5 years. Currently, the program is authorized through 2026, so we're in good shape, but we need to get it reauthorized to go beyond that. The good news, as I said, I want to start on a bright note, is Representative Joyce, Republican of Ohio, with Representative Debbie Dingell, Michigan, a Democrat, introduced a bill to reauthorize the program with 30 other members from across the Great Lakes region. Representative Joyce introduced that bill quickly on January 9th. And so it's great to see again that whether it's Democratic or Republican members of the Great Lakes delegation care about the Great Lakes, and they want this program to continue. In the Senate, Senator Peters of Michigan with Senator Young of Ohio introduced the same bill in the Senate, also with bipartisan support. There's more work to do. It's great that these bills are introduced early in this Congress, the 119th Congress, but we got to make sure they get their hearings in the appropriate committees, that they get voted out of committee, that they go to the House and Senate floor, and get signed into law. So that's some work that we're doing. Again, good to have a good showing of bipartisan support for the GLRI. Dipping into some challenges ahead for us. I think anybody who's following the news can see that there are staffing cuts across the federal government, including at the US EPA. Those cuts are starting to happen. They're already impacting Region 5 and the Great Lakes National Protection Office, where the GLRI program is administered from. And just yesterday, it became clear that much deeper cuts across EPA and federal governments are coming in the months ahead. So to me, the challenge is the opportunity of the bipartisan support for GLRI, but we need the money, the budgets, the staffing for the agencies upon which that program rests to be able to do the work. And so we're going to have to hold Great Lakes members accountable, not just to support the GLRI, but to make sure that the GLRI can function and do its job, that we get cleaner and better Great Lakes, restored wetlands, protections for wildlife and fisheries and communities that depend on them. So that's more work ahead for us. I'll jump to two other quick things that we at ELPC are working on in this moment of chaos. There's been a lot of attention to the funding freeze that the Trump administration is carrying on, USAID being a big example. In our space where we work, we are very focused on the Rural Energy for America program, or REAP, that enables farmers and rural small businesses to get energy efficiency and renewable energy investments to improve the rural economy and the farm economy. Many farmers and rural small businesses who had grants commitments from the USDA have had those frozen. So they've done the work, they've put the renewable energy or the energy efficiency investments in place. The USDA needs to do its part to give them the funding that was promised. So we're working in Congress and we're working to help build pressure to get those grants unfrozen, and doing outreach across the country so that we can do more storytelling about how that freeze is impacting this important program that's part of the Farm Bill. ELPC also works is very focused on the clean school bus program that allows school districts to transition from dirty diesel to clean electric school buses. Those funds were also frozen, but we helped put a lot of pressure on EPA through engaging in getting stories into the media and to members of Congress. And it looks like those funds are now flowing. Hopefully, school districts will be able to get the monies they were promised towards the purchase of electric school buses, cleaner rides for kids. I'll stop there. I mean, those are some big priorities and things we're focused on, but there's a lot happening in DC, and I'm happy to come back and talk more.
Obviously, there's a lot we could talk about with this Congress. Thank you, Ann, for what you're doing and for the quick wrap-up summary. And Dave McEllis, tell us what's going on in Springfield. Talk a little bit about wetlands, will you, and what's to come over the next 3 months of session.
Sure. So thanks, Howard. I'll first do a little overview of Illinois and where we're at and how Illinois is pushing back on the Trump administration, and then a couple of areas of focus that we're looking at this session. So in the first Trump administration, particularly after Governor Pritzker took office, the state did take steps to insulate itself and respond to the federal government and some of the federal rollbacks, particularly after the Dobbs decision and in protecting reproductive rights. So we expect that the state's going to continue to minimize some of the damage, attempt to fight back, and attempt to insulate itself. There still remains, after the 2024 election, supermajorities with large supermajorities in both chambers of Democrats, and Governor Pritzker remains for the next 2 years as the governor, should he run for re-election in 2026. That remains to be seen. And Governor Pritzker has been out front in criticism of the federal government, and Attorney General Kwame Raoul has been challenging those executive orders and grant freezes. There has been some talk about Trump-proofing Illinois by setting state environmental and labor standards to pre-Trump levels, but we have not seen a proposal on that. There was some talk about possibly doing that in the lame duck session earlier this year, but nothing came up. So we will see if that comes up in the next few months, but that still seems to be a focus of the state. A lot of the focus recently has been on the budget. Last year, Governor Pritzker's office projected a potential $3 billion deficit due to diminished tax revenues and inflation. So the governor's proposed budget this last week was it actually included a smaller than expected deficit, which was a small bright spot, but there will still be some tightening. So on top of that not so rosy budget picture, you also have the specter of potential federal cuts looming. And just this week, Governor Pritzker said that his administration was looking for $1.8 billion in funds that had not been granted from the federal government. So with all of that, the legislature and the governor's office are talking about staffing, agency staffing, and budgets at the different agencies. So that's kind of overarching all of the other conversations that are happening right now in Springfield. A few of the areas where ELPC is looking to engage this session, one is public transit and the funding cliff at the public transit agencies, the CTA, Metra, and RTA, as well as PACE. So that's we're a member of a coalition supporting the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act, or MMA, and the last ELPC Thinks did a deep dive into that legislation with one of the sponsors. So I will encourage folks to look back at that one. But that's one of the main focuses. On the energy front, actions at the federal level won't stop ELPC's work at the Illinois Commerce Commission and Illinois Power Agency and some of the state agencies that are implementing previously passed legislation like the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So there will still be renewables procurements, grid planning processes, and responsible utility rate cases that ELPC will be engaged in at the utility level. Didn't want that to go without saying that once legislation is passed, there's a lot of work that goes into implementing that, and ELPC attorneys are working on all of those processes at the Public Utilities Commission. And along with members of the Clean Jobs Coalition, this year there will likely be discussions around energy storage and energy efficiency, and ELPC will be involved at the state level in that legislation should energy legislation pass. Howard, you set it up earlier. Finally, a situation that is the direct result of Trump's Supreme Court, the misguided Sackett decision that stripped federal clean water protections from many of our nation's wetlands, specifically harms Illinois because Illinois did not have a standalone Wetlands Protection Act. So we've been working with a coalition to introduce the Illinois Wetlands Protection Act that would restore those protections to these vital areas of our state. With that budget reality, there will be a challenge there with asking an agency to implement a wetlands protection regime, but this is something that we think should be a priority of Governor Pritzker in the many ways where the governor wants to step up and have the state step up where the federal government has stepped back. We believe that wetlands and wetlands protection could be a huge win for the state and a huge win for the governor.
Thank you, David, and thank you both, David and Ann, for what you're doing and being effective in terms of moving things forward. And to just pick up a couple of points here, the wetlands work in Illinois, past wetlands protection, that's seizing the offense for ELPC to move forward in the states where the federal government, in this case, the Supreme Court, has stepped back. Likewise, what David's describing on battery storage in Illinois, again, stepping up and moving forward. We're on the offense to try to get things done. And what Ann described is a lot of defense in Washington, but when it comes to the Great Lakes, there's really strong bipartisan support, as Ann described. And the Great Lakes, where we live, work, and play, has almost become nonpartisan. So there's a huge budget squeeze, but we're going to try to translate into support for the appropriations for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. All those senators and representatives say, we love the Great Lakes. Well, they're going to need to step up. And as Ann put it, have some accountability in terms of actually putting, the money where the mouths are when it comes to protecting the Great Lakes. So there are a lot of things we can do where we think we can make a serious difference going forward. We're going to be playing defense in the federal courts. Who's kidding who? We're looking at the Trump administration trying to roll back, decades of Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, toxics protections for the American public, some of which apply and have a particular harmful effect in the Midwest. ELPC litigation attorneys are already in the federal courts with regard to the methane pollution reduction standards. Methane is a greenhouse gas that, depending on your analysis, is something like 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And here we have the Trump administration trying to roll back methane standards, and we have some industry groups who are challenging it. We're in the courts on methane. We're in the courts on dealing with some Great Lakes protection issues. So ELPC is hiring up more litigation attorneys, tremendously talented people. No big surprise, we're going to need to be in the courts defending our core environmental values, the rights of people to breathe healthy, clean air, the rights of people to drink safe water, and the rights of people to live in communities without toxics. We're stepping up, we're hiring, we're increasing our legal firepower, and we will be among the handful of national environmental groups that are going to be working to protect the public's interests during this regime that's seeking to roll back environmental protections that truly have the support of broad swath of Americans. President Trump said he supports pure, clean water, pure, clean air to breathe. We're going to hold him to that. All righty, I have some questions, Ann and David, maybe you can comment on. And talk a little bit about how federal funding cuts impact state level implementation. And then David, take that from the Illinois side, how the budget squeeze affects the ability of the state of Illinois to get things done.
Well, when we think about federal budgets, whether that's money that goes to EPA in particular for a broad set of work, clean air and clean water, a lot of that money actually ends up going to the states to do that work, to support state implementation of clean water programs or clean air programs. So I think there's some real concern with how not only staffing cuts in DC will play out in the ability of the agency to do its work, but when it comes to appropriations, whether those programs take big cuts and therefore there's less money to send to the states to do the work that the state agencies do with federal funding. That's important across the country. There's also significant potential cuts to state revolving funds that support investments in clean water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure. So there's a lot of things on the horizon that are of real concern for us. I mean, next week is Great Lakes Days. Groups will be coming from across the Great Lakes to meet with members of Congress and their staff. I'll be joining the Alliance for the Great Lakes and others coming in from Illinois to meet with the Illinois delegation on these issues. Folks will be coming in from Ohio and Minnesota and Wisconsin, New York, Pennsylvania, to have these meetings to talk through our priorities, whether that's the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and reauthorizing it. But again, it's the appropriations, it's the programs, it's the other aspects of protection of the Great Lakes that we need to make sure Congress hears about and will support. So that's an answer, I hope, to your question, Howard. You're on mute, Howard.
Dave, take it away. Impact on Illinois, and talk a little bit, if you will, about not just that negative side of the impact, but where are you optimistic about things getting done in Illinois?
Yeah, and we've in Illinois, I think, had a little bit of a preview of what the Trump administration was going to do under the Rauner administration, where we didn't have a budget for multiple years and where there were cuts to agencies and cuts to vital programs. And it was really painful. And there was also this shedding of state employment. And I think that that will be something that the state will struggle with, is just, I think, which of those employees, as Howard, you noted, where are there federal agreements, where are there federal funds that are going to pay for state employees? And I think over the last few years, since the Rauner administration, since the budget has gotten a little bit under control, hiring has gotten better at some of those agencies, and the budget has gotten better at IEPA and Illinois DNR, but it still hasn't reached a point where it was probably 20 years ago or more. So I do think that there are still places where we need more staff at the state level and to do the work that previously was done. But I think that there's also the fact that we have had a decent budget the last few years that has at least maintained employment and hasn't had cuts. There's hopefully room to build there at the state level to do some of that work. But as you said, it will be difficult, and agencies were told last year to be ready to come in with either budget cuts and definitely not for increases in staffing and increases in budget. And so I guess it does also remain to be seen what of the federal money, and we've talked with some legislators who are interested in talking to the agencies, getting the agencies to come to do subject matter on the impact of federal funding cuts to the state agencies, particularly at IEPA.
You know, David, you mentioned earlier that some of the new budget forecasts are a little bit rosier for Illinois. I know it's a challenging year, but the trend line's a little bit better. How does that augur for things like wetlands protection legislation and other things? Does that create a little bit of headroom that programs that are not huge, big dollar commitments have some more room to go forward?
We hope so. And we hope that that's a place where our sponsors on the wetlands bill are looking for places where there is either existing money or if there is room to have a slight budget increase to get a program started, a program that will be mostly self-funded once it is implemented, because the Department of Natural Resources will be able to set permitting fees. If that is the case and they can get some money to start up the program, I have a little bit of hope that maybe there's something that if the governor's office decides that they want to make that a priority, that the legislature will find some funds to appropriate for that.
Thanks. And Garrison Regal has a question about what's your guess? And at this point, we all know it's just guess, but you're applying some judgment here on the future of the federal tax credits for solar, both residential and commercial. How do you see that playing out?
Well, that question gets to the issue of reconciliation. The House and Senate are in the process of doing budget reconciliation now, with the target of a $4.5 trillion program of making permanent Trump's tax credits. In order to pay for that, they're going to have to find money elsewhere. Some on the places they'll start to look are the various tax credits, particularly those that were set up under the Inflation Reduction Act to address climate and create investments in clean energy across the country and clean vehicles. So as Ways and Means Committee begins to work on how they're going to come up with the money they need to come up with as their share of this bill, those tax credits like that are very much on the table, and at risk for sure.
Got it. EV tax credits. How do you see that playing out at the federal side, recognizing we have it also in Illinois at the state side in terms of they're not tax credits, they're rebates. Yeah. But how do you see the federal side playing out? And folks, if you have questions for Ann and David and me, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to respond to some of them.
Yeah, again, that also is a reconciliation related credits. The Inflation Reduction Act extended an existing tax credit for purchase of new electric vehicles with some conditions, both an income threshold condition and also conditions related to where the many resources that go into the battery and such come from. So there was a tax credit for extension of the tax credit for new electric vehicles, a tax credit for used electric vehicles. There's a tax credit for the leasing of electric vehicles, but also related to the manufacturer, both in manufacturing of the vehicles and for the batteries. So when we're talking about the electric vehicle consumer credit, I think it's really an ecosystem of credits. You got to have the consumers to buy the vehicles and incentivize this transition to clean electric vehicles. But you also needed to incentivize the manufacturer of both the batteries and the vehicles here in the United States. That's what the IRA was intended to do. Certainly the consumer tax credit, the $7,500 tax credit or so for electric vehicles, is definitely in the bullseye for reconciliation as a place to get money. The other vehicle related tax credits, the used one may not be so much in the bullseye because it's not as big and not as impactful on the budget. But these are real concerns because again, we want to keep up these manufacturing tax credits. I think there's definitely splits within the Republican caucus. A lot of the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act went into southern states, went into red states and red districts. So we're definitely getting that tension within the Republican caucus about how they want to manage that in reconciliation. We might begin to see some proposals about phasing out the tax credit for electric vehicles, or otherwise. That's certainly work that we'll be paying attention to as part of the Clean Vehicles Coalition that ELPC works in with others to address these concerns.
Thanks, Ann. David, quickly, your sense, EV tax rebate in Illinois, if the federal EV tax credit rolls off, do we have a pretty stable EV tax rebate in Illinois, providing an incentive for people, or does that get caught up with the federal piece?
In the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, there was a $4,000 EV rebate created in that program. That rebate has never been funded to the extent that it needs to be. I believe that this year the governor proposed $14 million. I think last year there was maybe around that same amount. And really what that amounted to was that if you didn't get your application in within the first week or two, the money was gone. The way that it was set up also prioritized low-income applicants. So if you were a low-income applicant, you could apply throughout the application period, and those would be prioritized. And then whatever money was left over went to the non-low-income applicants. So there were a lot of people who applied for those rebates who did not receive them. I think it would need to be funded a lot more, or they need to figure out a way to stretch the funds. There's been some proposals of limiting it to a certain income threshold to extend those funds a little bit further, or limiting the amount, limiting the price of the vehicle. But initially, there were no limitations on those rebates, just a limitation in terms of funds.
So at least for now, rebates are still there. We'll see whether the amount that's being made available is sufficient to meet the demand, but it's not linked because it's under CEJA. It's not linked to the federal program.
Correct.
Right. Let me turn to a different question from Alan Lindrup. Talk a little bit, David, about the Metro Mobility Act. Some of you may know, as David mentioned, CTA Metra are facing a fiscal cliff by 2026. Metro Mobility Act is designed to provide both funding and reform. A lot of controversy, a lot of counter trends. But as some of you have heard me say, if you want a green Chicago, no good CTA, no good public transit, no green Chicago. Ditto regarding Metra. So how does it look, Dave? What's your just outlook on all that for Springfield?
Yeah, I think this is one of the major focuses of the environmental community, and as well as the transit community, is attempting to do something around both the funding as well as the governance structure of our transit system. And in the past, what's been said by the legislature is no new funding without governance reform. There's currently, I believe, close to 50 appointed officials running the different transit boards. The Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act would limit that down to under 20. So this would greatly reduce the number of voices in the room governing those different bodies, and create a unified system of governance for our public transit system. I do think that this is a priority both of the governor as well as of the legislature. Nobody wants to watch the transit system go under, and there would be serious cuts to services if there isn't a budget situation. I think the questions that remain are what in between the current system and the Metropolitan Mobility Act, what comes of the governance structure, and also where does the money come from? And I think those are questions that the conversations will continue. And I think both the legislative leaders and the governor have talked about getting that done before May.
Good. Brian Urbaszewski has some comments and questions about the rebates, not just the state EV rebate, but the ComEd program. I think that's principally for government and businesses more so than it is for individuals. Do you see that as being pretty stable, or is that really turning on, well, how's that turning on the mix of federal and state funds and ratepayer funds?
Yeah, I think there is some for business and governments, but also there is a ComEd program, I believe, that's open for individual for customers to have installation of charging stations. But I think that those CEJA provisions, those things that are going through the ICC, Governor Pritzker has appointed a very good Illinois Commerce Commission, and they're going through this beneficial electrification plan, and that is updated. And I think that those are pretty stable programs.
Thank you. Pete Bogger has a question or just a comment about appreciation for our highlighting the Metro Mobility Act. Talk a little bit about who are the groups who are leading the charge on that. I mean, ELPC, you, our colleague Kevin Brubaker, obviously playing a key role. So is the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club, our good colleague TK over there. Metropolitan Planning Council's been a key player. Who else is playing? Who's significant? Labor's weighed in. Talk a little bit about that, would you? What's the dynamic?
Yes. Yeah.
Roll
So
up the
there,
sleeves a little.
along with the environmental community, you have the civic community, you have the business leaders who want to see this get done, but also have questions about how it gets paid for. They recently put out an op-ed about that, basically saying, what is this going to look like at the end, and how much money is it going to cost us? You know, the concerns that the business community normally presents. At the legislative level, the leadership of that is Ram Villavalam, who spoke on our ELPC Thinks, as well as Representative Evadina Delgado, are the sponsors of the Metropolitan Mobility Act. And I believe Leader Cam Buckner in the House will be involved in the conversations around transit. On the NGO side, Active Transportation Alliance, our neighbors at 35 East Wacker, are also heavily involved in that.
Of course.
As well as the governor's office is going to play a big role in what this ends up looking like in the final estimation.
It didn't mean to leave out our good friends at Active Trans. For those who don't know, we're one floor apart in the 35 East Wacker office building. They're good friends, good colleagues. And let's see if we can start wrapping this up. Take a minute, just here's how it looks in Washington. Big things people ought to pay attention to, key legislation, key dates. David, how about if you do the same then in Springfield?
Yeah, thanks, Howard. Well, as we talked a little bit about reconciliation, that's the big thing right now. House has started that process. The Senate started a different process. They're going to have to get together and agree on what they're doing. It'll be the House's bigger package that will prevail. But this is where the work begins. I mean, the vote they had in the House the other evening just gets the process started. So now the instructions go to the various committees about how much they have to cut or how much they have to spend. And that's the hard work because, for example, the House Ag Committee has to come up with about $230 billion worth of cuts over 10 years. That's a lot of money. Will likely have to come out of programs that feed people, which become very controversial, or energy and commerce. We'll have to look at programs that protect people's health. And those will also become very controversial. So there's a lot of attention that will go into reconciliation. The timeline for reconciliation is more in the April timeframe because the Republican caucus in the House is very short at the moment in terms of their numbers, with folks having left for the administration. So there's some special elections, and Speaker Johnson will wait to replenish his ranks a little bit. So those are very important elections to watch. But that's really the big game. The other big thing that is coming up, would be remiss not to mention, is Congress has still not finished the appropriations for this fiscal year, FY 2025. The current, what they call a continuing resolution, expires, I think, March 14th. Congress has not figured out what their top line budgets numbers are for the rest of this fiscal year. So that work has to happen. Otherwise, you get what's called a government shutdown. I will not prognosticate on whether we will or will not have a shutdown, but that process is very important, particularly important in light of the cuts that are happening through the Elon Musk process of shutting down or really whacking away at things that Congress had appropriated money for. So there's a lot to follow, a lot to pay attention to, and we'll certainly be engaging where we can on the issues that are important to ELPC.
Thank you, Ann, not only for your comments, but for what you're doing. And as some of you know, ELPC is focused on the Midwest region. So Ann works with the staff, and we work with the Congress people, senators and representatives, from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, the Dakotas. We don't necessarily do a lot of work with the senators from New Hampshire or the senators from Utah. We focus on the Midwest. That's our sweet spot. Those are the people we know. That's the region in which we operate. And it tends to be quite complementary to a number of our national colleagues whose headquarters are in New York or Washington, or San Francisco or Los Angeles. Over time, they tend to know the East Coast and West Coast legislators better. We really know the Midwest and the Great Plains as well. And that's where we're particular, I think, sweet spot for ELPC's effectiveness in Washington, Great Lakes, of course, being beyond the Midwest, but that's our region. That's where we operate. David McEllis, take 45 seconds on, here's the highlights, lowlights of Springfield. What's going to happen? What should people pay attention to next?
I think the way that this ties together is what is the trickle down of chaos from DC, both monetarily as well as functionally. There's going to be budget issues, but there's also going to be some effort by the state to plug some of the holes of filling in programs that are no longer being covered by the state or by the federal government. So I think a lot is up in the air, and there's a lot of work to be done, both in the courts and at the state government level. The legislative session ends in May, so the process for the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act and the Wetlands Bill continues through May over the next couple months. And I think generally we're gonna have to see how the budget goes and what that budget looks like at the end of the year. But I think that people were feeling a little bit better last week than they were a couple months ago about it. But then the chaos of Washington leads us to the question of what other issues are they going to have to deal with. A couple action items that folks might take: contacting their legislators about those two initiatives, the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act, as well as the Illinois Wetlands Protection Act, and asking them to support those bills and sign on as co-sponsors would be a good place to start for folks on the call.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ann, for what you're doing and for joining us today. And thank you, everybody on this call, for what you're doing in terms of action and engagement to help make a difference in Springfield, help make a difference in Washington, D.C. ELPC is stepping up. We're standing up for core environmental values. We're not sitting down. We're not stepping back. We are stepping up our game, more firepower to protect core environmental values in the Midwest environment. Keep an eye out for future ELPC Thinks, on where we'll be talking about more of the issues that affect our environment every day. Thank you. Be well, and keep doing the important work that you're doing. Let's work together to help protect our environment, people, and communities in the Midwest. Best wishes, and see you soon.